It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to someone who I'm sure a lot of you have heard speak before, Ben Johnson. It's kind of cool. Ben and I first started working together back in 2003. That makes us sound really old, but seems sometimes like it was just yesterday when I think we probably had a room. What was that room we worked in? Probably like 20 by 20,
Yeah.
and there were 6 or 7 of us working in that room doing some pretty good stuff. I was reminiscing about that the other day, but definitely a long background career-wise of pretty fascinating efforts, both company-wise as well as just mission-wise. Formative years of Carbon Black, working with Obsidian now as well, and always interesting to hear your perspective. So I'm glad to have you here. And I'm especially interested now with us looking at the service-based economy, at the way that we might extend the concept of threat hunting into that world of software as a service, which has been a bit of a void in our site picture for some time. So I'm excited for some of your ideas on how we can make good at that and how we can improve the game. So without any further delay, happy to turn it over to you, Ben, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Phil. Always great, and we don't get to catch up enough. And thanks to everyone else for giving me a little bit of your day. Let me move to see if I can. I guess that'll stay there in the window. Also, thank you. I know today's kind of a little bit of a somber anniversary for us in the United States. So thank you for letting me speak and give me some time today because we got a lot of things on our minds, I think. So let me see here. And Phil, you'll be happy to know I put a shirt on. I dressed up for you because I'm in Southern California. It's hot out and that kind of thing. But look, a lot of what I've been doing over the last few years is thinking about cloud security and most specifically SaaS. And a lot of what's been happening in my discussions is that security teams just don't really know what they should be doing, right? I'm talking straight up to CISOs, even though I'm a vendor. We have a very cordial, like friendly conversation. It's not sometimes the sort of vendor versus buyer conversation where everyone's guarded. It's like, no, dude, just help me like think about the problem. I'm not even looking to buy tech or do whatever right now. It's just like help me think about the problem so I can educate the business, right? So I'm spending a lot of time thinking about that, and then I really love threat hunting and incident response, so it felt like a really good pairing of topics. Now, my background, and yeah, hopefully I've spoken with a bunch of you before. Got my start at NSA in 2000, and saw the whole 2000s basically of a lot of conflict out there, and got to work with great people like Phil and Rob Lee and others. Just a great team. Incredible talent density. We did some amazing things that I would have done. I think we all would have done for free, and they actually paid us for. So it was pretty phenomenal. And then I got a little bit tired of the government world, so I wanted to do something on the commercial side. So ended up working with a few friends, and the idea for Carbon Black came up, and so I became one of the founders there and the CTO, and get to travel the world, speaking to lots of different organizations. I estimated about 600 different enterprises globally about endpoint security, but really everything. And then we grew to about 800 people, and I kind of wanted to do it again, so started Obsidian with a couple other guys, Glenn and Matt, and we're focused more on kind of cloud detection and response and threats in your SaaS and stuff like that. So this is not meant to be a vendor pitch or anything like that, but really focused on kind of what's going on with all these different applications. And then I love the national security mission, so I was fortunate enough to join the U.S. FISA court and get to work with some really interesting people, will say, on some very interesting cases. So that's enough about me. I just want to dive in now. I think if you've seen me speak before, I almost always have this slide or something very similar. I just hope that I guess we have about 40 minutes total. At the end of the 40 minutes, hopefully you felt this was time well spent, right? And so hopefully you get some forced reflection time, some contemplation, give you some stuff to remember, that kind of thing. Usually if it's an in-person conference, it's like, hopefully you get some time to shut off the laptop, put down the phone, and actually consume some information to think about your challenges, your goals, your strategies with your security program. A little bit more difficult, maybe, like some of you might be on your corporate Slack right now or checking email or whatever, but at least hopefully you're listening in. Um, and so looks like we have a little bit of font challenges, but that's okay. We'll roll with it. Cloud is accelerating business, and the whole really notion of a security team right now is to enable business to advance its mission safely. And I'm basically stealing quotes out of different CISOs' mouths of like, hey, I just need to enable my business to advance its mission and do it with minimal risk, right? And I think 2020 and the global climate and the work from anywhere really just kind of exacerbated the problem of how do we allow people to connect from different places. Now we have 1,000 offices for 1,000 people or whatever, right? So there's just a lot going on, and cloud is really at the center of it now, and especially SaaS, right? And so if you don't have SaaS yet, it's coming. I probably don't even need this slide anymore because everyone is like on Zoom, for example, or you're using GSuite or Office 365 or probably hundreds of other applications. But the whole point is, it's only going to continue to be part of our businesses, right? You talk to CISOs, and like I sort of said, and I think put in the abstract, the journey will end in SaaS. Like none of us want to manage hardware. None of us want to manage really anything below what the business needs, the business application, the business value. So if we can outsource that to service providers, if we can outsource that to the actual SaaS applications, we, I think, would love to do it. And it's not just about an individual SaaS app. Like if you're not familiar with some of this stuff, like these apps talk to each other. There's integrations between so many of them. It's basically n squared problem. Like pretty much everything can integrate with everything else, which makes our jobs as defenders challenging to try to just kind of defend all the ways in and all the ways data can flow out, right? Now, this is probably something you've already seen, and certainly seen if you've gone to a cloud security summit, or maybe you've even used a slide like this. But essentially, just as you go from on-prem to IaaS to PaaS to SaaS, you have less and less responsibility. However, you still have responsibility for things like who has access, what devices are being used to access that, what's the data inside it, and how's that data being used, what's the behavior, that kind of thing. So even though it's someone else's infrastructure and the data is living there, the accounts and everything else is living there, you still have the responsibility to defend it, right? And a lot of cloud, like a lot of times when you hear cloud, people think IaaS, but a lot of it's SaaS. And I'm actually stealing this quote from one of the SANS instructors. But 75%, or at least some majority of cloud, is SaaS, and I think it's only getting more popular with things like the 2020 climate. So SaaS security needs to be priority. Apologize, this was a white slide, so it's a little bit easier to see. I'll take the fault of getting Jennifer the slides late, so my fault, but hopefully you can still see this. But everyone's using SaaS. You're going to these applications. And guess what? If you read like a Salesforce article or the documentation on Microsoft's website or other things, like they're still telling you like you need to be regularly monitoring this and looking at it and stuff like that, right? And you have these always on targets. You have users that are just, let's be honest, it's tough wrangling our employees, our user population. There's not a lot of expertise in sort of detection or hunting that we'll talk about. Because it's new. Like we all grew up looking at malware, looking at IOCs from the endpoint, looking at DNS and other I'm sure great talks that are going on the last couple of days. We grew up with that stuff. We're more comfortable with that. But what do you do when you have everyone using Duo and you have everyone on Slack and these kinds of things, right? So it's just a new world. And then of course there's always over access. Everyone has too much access, which just increases risk. And then all these different systems are disparate and different logs and that kind of thing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So it's a little bit of a challenging problem. I just want to do a time check. Cool. And just again, I like to quote you all. IT is going from 0 to 100 in the cloud and leaving us in the dust, or we're blind to all these new SaaS accounts. A lot of IRs now are Office 365 or other SaaS-based applications, and there's lots of accounts and often no governance. So it's sort of stacked against us. So we have to do something here. Okay. Now I'm kind of blending detection and hunting, and I'll tell you why in a second. But well, maybe I'll just tell you now. I feel like if you're not already doing detection, like good detection in some of these applications, it's really the same doing detection and hunting. Now, I don't think those two things are the same thing. And in fact, I think I have a slide in a second about that. But I'm going to talk about them almost as if they're the same thing, but I'll explain why I think they're actually very different things in a second. But when we think about cloud, so we said we want to enable the business to advance its mission safely, right? So we want to protect the business, but a lot of these tools are in place because they're adding productivity gains. They're saving cost. Like if you start to get in the way of those things, you're going to get yelled at, right? And so you want to maintain those good relationships. You want people to listen to you, to come to you before they install that application, which no, doesn't usually happen. Um, so what can you do? Well, you do need to do things like reviewing access and monitoring access. You need to understand privilege, and I sort of break those apart: access versus privilege. And then you need to think about how things are configured, and ultimately, what is the behavior? How are people using these applications? And if you think about it, it's really not that different from on-premise. However, most of the actual application, the stack, the underlying infrastructure, that's not in your control. You can't just go lock down something in the OS when it's a SaaS application, because you have no control. You might even be able to lock down the SaaS application. So it is a little bit different. And you have to kind of work around some of that stuff. And so when you think about it, choose your framework: protect, detect, respond, whatever. But you want to worry about like what's going on with account access. Is there responsible use? Is there responsible collaboration? And then really, can you detect misuse, compromise, unwanted behavior, and then investigate, right? Really detect and respond. And just because you don't necessarily see a lot of problems, like maybe at the newspaper headline level, or your company doesn't feel like it's on fire, that doesn't mean it's healthy, right? I stole this from a TED talk about health, but the absence of disease does not mean health. And often in these SaaS applications, there's a lot of just kind of risk and hygiene issues and stuff too, which we'll talk about as well. So thinking about hunting, and I know everyone has a slightly different maybe definition of hunting, but to me, if you have 100% of all the unwanted behavior, basically all the threats that are in your environment, your technology is never going to detect 100%. So let's say your technology detects 80%, just as an easy number. So that remaining 20% gap, to me, is where a human has to go in with a thesis or a hypothesis or some intelligence and go look for activity, access, for other items that shouldn't be occurring or existing in your environment. So it's the gap between where the technology has stopped alerting you and detecting you and surfacing it, and the totality of threats. So to me, really, hunting is you go find something that wasn't automatically kind of surfaced for you. And then the idea is you go back and improve detection so it gets closer and closer to 100%, knowing that there's always change, there's always care and feeding, that kind of thing. So that's where detection and hunting are, to me, very similar. But if I hear automated threat hunting, to me that's detection. That's literally the definition of detection. But then when it's manual, more of a human activity where you're applying your critical thought, your time, your investigative and sort of review skills, that's hunting, right? And so it's kind of going to be blended together here, because I'm guessing a lot of people are not doing the detection, right? So it's kind of like, hey, a bunch of things you're talking about should just be detected. Well, yeah, but if you haven't done that, you have to go hunt for it and then turn it into a rule, right? So that's where I'm coming from. And then when you're doing hunting, to me, it's all about very fast, sort of left, right, left, right, left, right, right? Similar to, I think, IR or triage. Like you have a thread to pull, and then you start going down one path. Well, the goal is to very quickly invalidate that path, because you could go down forever and it's the wrong path. So the quicker you can invalidate that and go a different direction or pivot on a different IOC or different attribute, the better. And hunting's kind of the same way. Like the quicker you can basically exclude, the better you'll do. And to me, hunting is really more about exclusion than inclusion. You basically see what's going on and you like filter out a bunch of stuff. Okay, see what's left, filter out a bunch of stuff, right? That kind of thing. But it's all about trying to move fast, because none of us have enough time here. So think about detection. What do you want to detect? What are your concerns around external attackers? What are your concerns around malicious insiders? You could pick and choose what you're thinking about. But then with hunting, it's really like, well, what are you looking for? What are you trying to think about? And then do you have the data and do you have the time, right? And then, finally, before I dive into a little bit more specifics, I've given a couple talks like at B-Sides Augusta, B-Sides Columbus, where this is kind of blown up into a whole talk. But it's basically like you can slow attackers down, you can speed defenders up, you can encourage good choices or discourage bad choices. That's basically everything we do, right? And so my sort of question, and we'll come back to this, is when you're hunting, are you finding things? It doesn't have to be an adversary or evil. It could be a gap, it could be a misconfiguration, it could be other deficiencies in your environment that can be the outcome from hunting, from the sort of the reviewing, that helps you actually harden for making it harder for attackers to get in, or you find some gaps in your telemetry collection, and then okay, so you're going to actually speed defenders up by fixing that. So just want to throw this out there, but it's not just about finding evil. It's actually about how can you use these kind of hunt missions to just improve everything. It's kind of like in a tabletop exercise. You probably improve all sorts of stuff, not just technical controls, but communication and all sorts of other policies and such, right? So same thing here. And then, are you going to use native tooling, or are you going to pull telemetry? Well, I'll cheat and tell you that you can pretty much use native tools, but you're gonna get very frustrated. And so I'm gonna go actually more through native tooling, but what you're gonna wanna do is probably centralize the telemetry, similar to what you'd wanna do maybe elsewhere in your tech stack, right? You're not gonna wanna bounce between specific like Windows event logs. You'd rather pull all that back to an EDR provider or something like that. It's kind of the same thing in SaaS, but probably even worse because the logs are so different. But you can still do some things in some of the native UIs, native consoles, right? So okay, getting a little bit more detailed here, right? The primary goal here is to keep adversaries out, but then you want to understand, kind of what your privileged users are doing, any changes, and then, understanding sharing and things like buckets, other things like that. And then, any changes to the surface area. So these are all areas you need to start thinking about if you're not really thinking about this in SaaS. And then this could lead to like, okay, maybe I'm gonna go hunt for this kind of activity. And then insider threats, we've seen a huge uptake in people concerned about insider threats, either A, because they just feel like they have more IP or more concerns around insiders having uncertainty about job prospects and things like that. So they might, have a little bit more disgruntled employee population. And we've seen some pretty nasty, someone deletes all the S3 buckets on the way out the door kind of thing in production, which is not fun for anybody. But, just especially if you're IP heavy company, insider threats become very interesting as well. So if we're thinking about, stuff like logins, and let's say you dove into Microsoft 365, um, they're going to give you like the list of all the logins, like who's logging in and where they're logging in from, right? So that's cool. And you can start to search based on timestamp and, date time and things like that. However, if you see, it's not the best kind of UI to use for hunting, right? It's really there's no geolocation information. You can do some exclusion and things like that. So I would rather have you start looking at some of this data than do nothing, but you're probably going to run into some limitations pretty quick. And if you think about GSuite, and if you've ever played around in GSuite, you can kind of do the same thing. Like you can log in, you can look for IP addresses and do some filtering and stuff like that, and start to find like where are some logins coming from. Because this might sound super basic, but do you even know where people are logging in from to your SaaS, like to GSuite? Like I'm guessing most people don't. I talked to companies that have 183 countries logging in, and they thought they had like 3 because they realize all their people are all over and they have customers logging into some of these SaaS apps and stuff like that. But it's just this hasn't really been central to your sort of visibility and monitoring. So there's often a lot of surprises here. Now, again, the challenge here is you're not necessarily getting geolocation information. So something to consider, but I would still recommend diving in and starting to just look at and get comfortable with how are people logging in and what's going on. Are they using password? Are they using SAML? Other kind of methods to get in, that kind of thing. And then if you look at something like Salesforce, Salesforce does a little bit better job. I have plenty of issues with Salesforce. It's a huge application with all sorts of craziness inside it. However, if you look at it, they do some geolocation information. They give you the application, maybe even if there's different login URLs, things like that. Sometimes there's none here, but sometimes they'll try to fill in the browser information. So this is where you can maybe start to dive in and start to look for anomalies and things like that, like some application you didn't expect was being used to log in or some location, right? So really starting to get a little bit more context here, which helps you hunt, right? You can't really hunt if you don't have any sort of understanding of the data or context. The more you can start to pull together, the better, right? So Salesforce is doing a little bit better job here for stuff like logins. So if I summarize this, and I have a few of these little like areas to discuss, to give you some ideas of where to maybe start, like simply looking at admin login times and locations. Your admins, and I've observed organizations that have hundreds of thousands of SaaS accounts, like big organizations and such. They still usually have pretty small admin population, which is great. And the admins are almost always in like one or two countries, even if it's like a global company, right? Maybe the admins are in the US and the UK or India and Netherlands or whatever, but it's not like 100 countries. So can you start to hunt for suspicious kind of locations and things like that? And if you think about my earlier comments, this should all be turned into a simple detection rule. But the reason I'm calling it hunting is because you probably are not doing detection here yet. So you have to go hunt for it and then convert it to a detection rule, right? And then after the admin, sort of population, you have the overall user population, which again could be 10x, 100x, 1000x the admin population. So are there unusual login locations, things like that? It's kind of hard to predict timestamps and such because everyone has like their phone logging in all night. So it kind of looks like you're pretty much logging in all the time. But locations and such should be useful. And I'll give you some hints. Like Slack, for example, on our phones logs in all the time and is a great sort of tracker of where you're at when someone goes on, like we use Slack at Obsidian. When someone goes on vacation overseas, you can basically see every single city they've been in and stuff like that, because Slack is always logging in unless you shut it down. But can you use some of that information when you're kind of looking at the population? Of course, things trying to get ahead of the problem, spikes and failed logins for a particular user. And again, all this should be detection rules, but I'm bringing it up as hunting because I just see so many companies that are not doing any sort of detection like this. And then if there's a particular country that's just trying to log into a bunch of your users, especially if you don't have any people there, that kind of thing, that's great. And then maybe you can convert that into a conditional access policy or just block some IPs, things like that. Some of the SaaS applications support that. So that's it for logins. I'm going to run through a few of these and then kind of wrap up, and hopefully we're not too far over time. So the other thing to look at is access and privilege changes, right? So who's getting new privilege? I mean, that should be rare enough in your environment that it should be an alert every time it happens. But again, if you're not already alerting on it, can you go into your environment and look for certain events like add member to role in Microsoft, and then go see what's being given user? And sometimes they'll give you some extended JSON, extended properties, et cetera, where you can dive into more of the details and that kind of thing. And this is one of the areas where you have to start to get a little bit comfortable with some of these different logs and understand, but usually you can start to pull out like what's going on here. And then again, if you can convert that into a detection rule, never do it again, like never hunt for the same thing twice, right? I think, hopefully you can quote me on that. But I think that's something to look for. And if you look at something like GSuite, they often have quite a bit of information around this, where users are created, users are maybe given licenses or deleted or things like that. But certainly if they're given extra roles, you want to look for that. You want to go hunt for that. And then in GSuite, they actually have some detection rules you can turn on that will email you. Last I checked, it'll only email the admins, which is kind of a deficiency because a lot of times the security team is not the admin of these apps. You're sort of at the mercy of the application owner. But at least, if users granted admin privilege, that kind of thing, they could get an alert, and then you don't ever have to hunt for this again. You just sort of get told when this happens, right? So what should you care about? Like, of course, new privilege is granted. This should be rare enough that you should flag every single time from a detection rule. But again, if you're not hunting for it right now, go hunt for that like immediately. Removal of privilege access too. This is often just something good to check on. Was this a person departing? Were they changing job functions? Was it an adversary who's trying to remove privileges from the global admins or things like that? And then if there's maybe some other things like mailbox delegation, like if I'm given delegation rights to the CEO, I don't actually have to log in as the CEO. I log in as myself, and then I can go read the CEO's email or send email on his or her behalf, right? And then can you correlate some of this stuff maybe to the source of truth, like the HR system and that kind of thing? And really keep an eye on contractors, consultants, and service providers. You might see an MSSP come into an environment, and then they add a bunch of admin accounts and things like that. Nothing trying to be malicious, but it maybe doesn't have necessarily the best hygiene. And then contractors come and go, and are their accounts kind of left behind? So just go hunt for this stuff. It's not necessarily saying this is full on adversarial, trying to compromise you left, right, and center. It's just, hey, this is stuff we see all the time, and companies really care about this because you want to reduce your risk, and you might have compliance requirements and things like that. And then when you look at admin activity, I mean, this is always good just to go in and look at the post login admin activity. Like, what are people doing? And some of it overlaps with what I just talked about. But are new users being created, suspended? Is data being copied from one account to another? Which usually the admins can do, especially if an account is suspended. Where did that account's data go. So go looking for that, right? That's kind of the stuff that I would say go look at right away if you're not already kind of doing some flagging and analysis of this stuff. And if you go into something like Dropbox or Box, they actually give you a lot of verbose activity. The one thing I don't love about these applications is that you kind of have to know what you're looking for. So on the left side, I have to literally add a whole bunch of different kinds of data that I think are all sort of admin data. And then I can export the logs or, kind of go look at it. And same kind of on the right side with, I'm forgetting which one's Box and Dropbox now. I apologize. But the whole point is like they have some really good data. It's a little bit tricky to get to it because you have to know kind of what you're looking for, but it's pretty cool once you start to pull the logs. So the data's there. You just got to go kind of looking through it. And so what should you care about when it comes to some of this admin activity? Well, provisioning and deprovisioning of accounts, not necessarily anything nefarious there, but changing settings, right? I mean, this can be huge. If all of a sudden someone flips a switch and MFA is no longer required for 100,000 employees, I would want to know about that. Again, that should be a detection rule, but we understand also it's hard to, maybe have detection rules in all these different systems. And so can you go hunt for this kind of activity? And then user level activity from an admin account. What do I mean? Well, you should have the separation of duty, right? You should have the admin that does admin stuff, and then that same human should have a user level account that does everything else. And what we see far too often is the admin account is doing all sorts of user level stuff like checking email and getting phished and all these other things. And it's like, just break them apart. So go look for that. Are you seeing, admin accounts do a lot of user level activity? Because that should be a quick win, very quick win. And then is anyone granting themselves access to resources, to mailboxes? This could be insider threat. This could be an external adversary that compromised, wanted to get access to some other things. And so really, this is just a great area to go looking for, threats and or mistakes. Do a quick time check here. Okay. Um, and then, broadly shared files and that kind of thing. A lot of a lot of these systems, the whole point of them is to share files or to share content of some sort. So if you go into something like GSuite, you can actually start to create filters and go hunting through the data around, what files were internal only that were then exposed and changed to external sharing, right? Because that tends to be a huge concern for companies, is who's sharing files externally. Maybe internally sort of fair game to share whoever needs it, but externally maybe it's not, allowed from policy, from compliance reasons, whatever, but it's usually not prevented in the application itself. So who's, sharing things publicly on the web or with a link that doesn't have a password or things like that. So go in there and, start to dive in and hunt. And by the way, I realize this is pretty different than looking for, kind of YAR rules or other things in binaries, but this is the reality of SaaS. Is you're looking at more kind of account-based behavior and that kind of thing, and trying to find both threats and risk, and really try to get to a better place. And then OAuth applications. It's incredible how much power our user populations get with OAuth applications, or at least the ability to install OAuth applications. So if you're not familiar with it, right, you've probably, or not familiar with maybe the terminology, a lot of us have probably logged into a different web app and said, hey, this app's requesting access to your, Google Drive or your, just your email details or whatever. And we say yes. Well, sometimes this is like, hey, this is requesting access to, just like I said, your entire Google Drive. You click that, now it can see all the files, right? Even files people are sharing with you and stuff like that. So, it depends on the scopes and, permissions and things like that. But this is just a massive area that is ripe for abuse. It's not really called out enough. And it's a nice way for adversaries to get around multi-factor authentication. Because if I phish you and you have MFA, I have to get through the MFA process and, sort of trick you to give me MFA tokens and, try to get maybe a different MFA factor so that I can get back in if I get kicked out. Whereas if I just send you a message and saying, hey, you're invited to this brand new Google Drive, beta, click here to give me access to your account, I have that OAuth token, I'm good. Like I don't need to even really log in as you. I can just go perform actions as you. And sometimes you can grant access on behalf of your whole company and things like that. So this is really an area to focus on. And it's not just things like Microsoft and G Suite. It's these are some screenshots from Slack, from Zoom, where you can add different applications and like who's adding what into your Slack. Like what have you contractually said you would allow in your Slack? And what kind of data? Because we all know Slack is often used to discuss maybe a customer issue, a product bug, those kinds of things where you might be sharing snippets of literally like, something that's quite sensitive. Well, this person over here just installed this chess game. I've seen all this stuff. This chess game, which is made by some developer who has no credentials and no, haven't really been authorized. Maybe there's nothing bad, but like you start to very quickly get uneasy about how fast your data could be flowing out and going to other countries, or just at least get people in scope that really shouldn't be in scope. And so just being aware of these third-party apps. And so if you have access to something like Zoom or Slack in some sort of privileged capacity, you can go review what people have added and really dive in there, right? And so if you're thinking about sharing, what should you care about? Well, sensitive scopes and grants, like if you're adding an app that has full Gmail access or similar, sharing externally with no password, I would go look for those kinds of activities. No password or restrictions, like so maybe it has an expiration but no password, or maybe it has a password, so that's cool. But just going to look for some of that stuff, and then the system level stuff. Hey, this is granted access to everybody's mailbox, right? Okay, maybe that's intended. Maybe it's like an email defense or something, but it should be rare enough that go find it and then convert it into a detection rule, right? And then often we see things like sensitive access was granted by an app and only one person out of 100,000 is using that app. Okay, might be fine, but like go look at it, right? Go look at it. That's risk. And then a few more things like users just adding applications to Slack, Salesforce, huge one, Zoom. One thing that quite frankly scared me a lot the other day was when I realized that users can create shared channels between Slacks. Right. So if you're not familiar, you have your Slack, you have someone else, other company's Slack. They added this cool feature where you can create like a pipe between the two. So everyone just logs into their own Slack, but now you have this shared channel between the two. You can actually just accept shared channels as a regular user, and now all of a sudden like other people in your company could get added to this Slack, and now maybe there's data flowing out to this whole other company, and there's no admins involved and things like that. So that scared me the other day when I saw that. um, External sharing to domains like Yahoo and Gmail and stuff like that, or mail forwarding rules, or sharing files, that kind of thing. And then something, I think SANS did a great job of sharing their IOCs with the recent kind of phishing attack and stuff. But applications that maybe manipulate mailbox to insert mail forwarding rules or other things where you're starting to combine stuff I'm talking about, can you go look for that? Can you go see, okay, who added this mail forwarding rule? Oh, as an app, that's really weird. Okay, let me go sort of dive in and kind of see what's going on there. So just a lot of stuff. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. Happy to talk more offline, or catch up some other time as well if anyone wants more details on any of these things. But just trying to get you to think about some of these things, because I know sort of SaaS hunting and detection and that kind of thing is not usually on everyone's mind, because we all grew up in this sort of endpoint and network and other areas of the tech stack type of hunting and response. So I briefly touched on this, which was really the totality of threats. And then to me, again, we all have our own definitions, but to me, detection is going to get you some of the way, hopefully 99%, but let's be real. It's never 99%. It's going to get you some of the way there. And then the rest of it, you got to go hunt and then tune and care and feed and, improve automated processes. So you're not always hunting, and, just really thinking about it like that. At least that's how I think about it. And then, giving you a few tips to sort of take away. Pick an application. Like each one of these, they have different logs, different UIs. Quite frankly, the security team does not usually have access to the app. It's the app owner. Maybe it's IT, maybe it's HR owns Workday, or sales team owns Salesforce, that kind of thing. So you're going to have to figure out how to get access. If you can pull telemetry out so that you don't have to worry about being in their UI, because those application owners are very concerned with uptime and availability, as they should be. Can you get telemetry out so that maybe you can do your enrichment, or do some improvements, so you're not just looking at IPs, you're actually doing geolocation or things like that. I would just say, like, who's logging in from outside the countries you expect? It sounds so simple, but it's hard in SaaS. Can you go look at that? Go look at who's logging in from other countries you didn't expect. Then look at privileged activity, shared files, third-party apps. And then once you start to get comfortable with that, then there's this whole set of data that I haven't really even gone into, which is just kind of the post login activity, like the hundreds of different events that you'll do as you just use OneDrive and SharePoint and Google Docs and all these other things. Like there's just a lot of different, events you can start to see and dive into. But if you haven't already looked at things like logins and admins and, shared files and things like that, then, you're probably missing some of the key, ROI and wins there. And there's some gotchas though, right? And I kind of mentioned the gotcha of getting the data. My number one surprise, straight up, my number one surprise, we're about almost 4 years into the Obsidian, as a company journey. My number one surprise was how disconnected security and the sort of application owners often are, right? So security now has to come to the table and, kind of get a seat and access and that kind of thing. So if you can navigate that, get the data, try to figure out how you can do it, maybe even audit logging or things like that weren't turned on, go check immediately. You don't want to get an IR tomorrow and the IR firm says, sorry, you didn't have any logging turned on. That happens a lot. And then where to begin, right? I suggest where a lot of your population sits. So Microsoft 365 or GSuite tends to have a huge number of users doing all sorts of crazy stuff, even if you're like 100 employees in your company. So I would go look at that. And then there are these other tricks that will get you. I promise they will get you if you don't think about it. You might do something in SharePoint and Microsoft is like, hey, I'm just going to run that query over in Brazil for you, even though you're in California. I don't know all the reasons why, but you'll see events all over the world sometimes, even if your people aren't there. So you have to start to figure out like, well, is this Microsoft running it in a data center on behalf of the user or things like that? It's not just Microsoft, but calling that out. And then you might have to stitch together account IDs. So it's like, hey, account ID 1234 did this action. And then you have to go look at, okay, which user in the inventory is account ID 1234. So if you can start to, stitch that together a little bit yourself, or just have a way of resolving that, you might have to do some of that stuff. And then just, probably what you're already doing in some other hunts, take the most common events and just exclude them. Right. And then start to narrow down to a much more kind of rare set of events. You're going to find some really interesting stuff going on. And then things like automated jobs or third-party apps, the OAuth apps, they can be incredibly noisy. Like the whole, I'm going to log into everyone's email box and look at every single email for phishing and stuff like that. Those are going to generate millions of events. So can you filter some of that stuff out, right? So that's just another gotcha. And then I mostly kind of mentioned this throughout, but it's not just about finding the adversary. I mean, yes, it is about that first and foremost, but every time you do a hunt, can you find gaps, weaknesses, etc., that either, if you fix it, excuse me, just went through puberty there. If you fix it, would slow the attacker down more, basically harden your environment more, get rid of basic authentication because that doesn't require MFA, etc. Can you speed your defenders up? Oh man, if I just change this setting, I'm going to have better telemetry, better incident response, better triage. Or hey, I'm seeing all this activity. Can I go back to the population and say, hey guys, we really got to start using passwords in file sharing, or these, just encourage good behavior or discourage bad behavior. So can you start to, kind of get all these outcomes as you're doing your hunt, because it's such valuable time. You want to learn as much as possible. SaaS is here. We get tons of apps. I think this is probably even outdated now, but back in 2019, 18 employees would mean that you already had 81 apps. It's just an explosion, right? Explosion of apps. And oops, I have a wrong logo here, so I apologize. But otherwise, thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions, but thanks for letting me ramble a little bit, and would love to stay in touch with everyone on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I'll be in the Slack as well.